Now, you've called the US and the UK rogue states. For most people who consume the mainstream media, who get their information from the propaganda system, that would seem like an outlandish claim. Can you just explain why you believe that and explain how you came to that conclusion?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a matter of fact, really, to say that the US and the UK are rogue states in their foreign policies. I mean, I think if you look at the record around the world over the last 80 years or so, since 1945, the record of military interventions, the number of coups, the number of cases of interference in other countries' affairs, the number of violations of international law. I mean, these things are routine. You know, they're routine and they're ongoing and they're permanent. And obviously, British and US governments say that they uphold international law and support for human rights and so on. But the reality of their policies is very different. I mean, to give you a solid fact, I mean, I looked for Declassified at the number of UK military interventions around the world since 1945, and I got to 83. So that's 83 over the last 80 or so years. Not all of those are malign, but many of them are. I'd say most of them are malign. And I also looked at the number of coups that Britain has promoted around the world since 1945, and I got up to 42. I think that is a very conservative estimate because there's obviously a lot of stuff that British officials have been getting up to over the years that we simply don't know about. There's a lot of covert operations that have never come out into the public domain after decades. So we're dealing with dozens and dozens of cases of intervention in other countries' affairs. And most of those coups, I would say, are malign. I mean, they're overthrowing sometimes popular, sometimes democratic governments, and they are stopping independent development of societies and people around the world. And I think that the facts are actually incontrovertible, that there is this history. The only problem is that we don't see enough of it. We don't see enough of it in journalism. We don't see enough of it in the academic world. And there has been, I would say, almost a conspiracy of silence when it comes to the complicity of mainstream journalists and mainstream academics in revealing this history, which can be easily discovered, actually, if one is prepared to go and have a look. You can go down to the National Archives in London, have a look at what British governments have been up to. There's a host of information down there on past episodes of British foreign policy. I've spent a lot of my time doing that. And from that, we can document what the reality of that foreign policy is, and it is really not very pretty. So yes, I think we should call Britain and the US rogue states.
And it's quite interesting what you're saying about British intervention and British coups, because the mainstream narrative we're fed is that the British Empire collapsed in the decades after the Second World War. Britain is no longer an imperial power. The US took over its operations. But in fact, and this is something I've seen a lot working with you at Declassified, the empire never died. The empire is still active. And it is basically an adjunct to the US empire. Can you talk a little bit about how the UK plays a role in the US empire?
Yeah. I mean, I think that is completely right. The empire did never die. And Britain still plays an imperial function, and it plays an important junior partner function to the US. And in fact, that was explicitly laid out. If you go back to the late 1940s, when British officials were contemplating their role in the post-war world, they decided to become a junior partner to the US. That was a quote from an official at the time. I think that official said, "We want to become a junior partner in an orbit of power predominantly under American aegis," was the quote that the official used. Very explicit outlining that the UK was going to play a kind of lieutenant role to the US. And sure enough, that has continued very, very strongly over the decades. I mean, I would say there are at least three main ways in which that's happened. I mean, there's a military function, which is where Britain plays the junior military role to the US in interventions around the world. We see that very clearly in, say, the invasion of Iraq in 2003. We see it now in Ukraine. And actually, we also see it in Gaza, where it's the US that's providing a whole host of weapons to Israel. But the UK is conducting a lot of military activity, some of which we don't know about, as you know, because you've investigated this more than anyone else, trying to find out what exactly the UK military role is around Israel's war in Gaza. But clearly there's intelligence and spy missions taking place, which you've also discovered recently. 200 British spy missions that the British have flown over Gaza in support of Israel. It's almost impossible to believe that that intelligence is not being passed back to the US and that Britain is performing a function for the US in those operations. And if you look back at the history of military interventions, you go back to Libya in 2011, or you can go back even longer, go to Vietnam in the 1960s, where Britain played a significant military role in support of the US wars. Alongside the military role is this intelligence role, where the British security agencies, MI5, MI6, GCHQ, particularly the latter two, defense intelligence as well, all are plugged in very overtly to the US intelligence networks, particularly the CIA and the National Security Agency. There are US bases in the UK that are often called RAF bases, but which actually are US intelligence bases, where the British allow the US intelligence officers, sometimes hundreds of them at certain stations, to operate, and they are plugged into a British network as well. So there's constant intelligence sharing between the two agencies. And there's a third role as well, which is more of a diplomatic role, particularly in places like the United Nations, where British diplomats often act as the junior partners of US diplomats, particularly in interventions. I mean, if you go back to the role that Tony Blair's government played to George Bush, particularly around the invasion of Iraq in 2003, I think Blair was acting as the Washington spokesperson. British ministers were defending US positions in the United Nations, effectively acting as at their behest, at the behest of Washington. So there's this across the board junior partner role, military, intelligence, diplomatic, and we obviously know some of that because there's been research that's been done, over the decades to document some of that, some of those links. But clearly, a lot of it is covert. A lot of it doesn't enter the public domain, but it's extensive, and no other state in the world plays such a supportive role to the US as Britain. And that really explains, I think, why the special relationship is so pernicious and why it should be so concerning to British people, to us as British citizens, because we are helping to maintain the US empire in a way that no other state really is.
And it's quite clear from what you're saying what the US gets from Britain in terms of its empire. But what does Britain get from being this kind of adjunct to the US empire? Because we get embroiled in all sorts of illegal wars, catastrophic wars, economically expensive wars. What do we get from it?
I think Britain gets, first of all, it gets a great power status. Because what British leaders decided in the late 1940s, after contemplating for a while becoming this third force in international affairs, officials in Attlee's government in the late 1940s seriously thought that they might be able to play a kind of become a third superpower in the world alongside the US and the USSR after 1945. They seriously thought that for a while, and they thought that they would exploit the resources of Africa and become rivals essentially to the US and the Soviet Union. They debunked that in the end, knowing that Britain simply didn't have the power to play that role in world affairs. So what they opted for was to become the junior partner to the US. That's why Britain acquired nuclear weapons, to uphold British power in the eyes of the Americans. That was really the major reason why Britain acquired nuclear weapons. I mean, of course, the public justification for it was the Soviet threat and all that, but actually the internal mechanisms were, we need to demonstrate to the US that we are still a great power. And hanging on to the coattails of the US over the decades, demonstrating that Britain has been the major supportive ally of the US, that's enabled Whitehall officials to continue to believe and to act as an important power in the world. And actually, if you think about it, if they hadn't done that, then they might have been reduced to a role of, say, in Italy or Spain in world affairs, maybe. They wouldn't have had the independent power to maintain a substantial global role. I think another reason for it is that the British see the Americans as the protectors of the British and Western economic interests around the world. It's US military power, in effect, that plays the ultimate kind of reassurance role to shape world order in the interests of Western corporations. And that has been the other major goal of British planners going back over these 80 years since the end of the Second World War. You know, there's been a political goal, which is to maintain great power status, and there's been an economic goal, which is to ensure that the world economic order benefits Western corporations and that states around the world don't deviate too much from the model that we want to promote around the world that benefits us and our corporations. So the Americans play a key role in sustaining that order for the British.
Okay, so we're talking here really about an Anglo-American empire, and there's been many episodes of this empire with these two countries working in alliance to extinguish popular movements, to overthrow democratic governments which aren't doing what foreign investors want. Can you talk about, there's one particular one which I think is kind of emblematic of how this system operates and also emblematic of how little regard this system has for human life and human rights. And that's the Chos Islands, which I know you've done a lot of work on, and not many people know about it. So can you just describe what are the Chos Islands and what happened there?
Yeah, it is a good example to look at when we're looking at Anglo-American power. So these are small islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean that in the 1960s had about 2,000 people living on them. They've been living there for several generations. A new territory was created by the British called the British Indian Ocean Territory. It was actually illegally created. It was created in defiance of the United Nations at the time, saying that these islands should actually have been decolonized. The Americans and the British undertook secret negotiations for the Americans to be able to establish a military base on the islands. This was in 63, 64. And the British agreed to that. The only problem being that those 2,000 people on the islands had to go. The Americans insisted that the British depopulate those islands. I mean, they literally flung these people off the islands that they'd been living on and working on for several generations. And actually, they dumped them in shanty towns and in poverty in the neighboring island of Mauritius. Paid them almost nothing in compensation in order to establish this base. Now, that base is still there. Diego Garcia is the largest of the islands in the Chagos Island group, and it's now a major nuclear-capable base for American bomber aircraft that are capable of carrying nuclear arms. It's been used in intervention operations in the Middle East over several decades. And when you look at the declassified files on that episode, I mean, they reveal the callousness of British officials when it comes to their attitude towards the people that they were depopulating. You know, they called them Man Fridays, they called them primitive, they didn't care what happened to them. You know, all that they cared about was sealing this military agreement with the US. And I think that is kind of emblematic of the way in which America and Britain have together behaved in the world over the last 80 or so years. Even though that's a small number of people, it's 2,000 people, you know, that's a small number of people, it's a small set of islands. But they've done similar things in many other countries around the world in the joint coups and military interventions that they've undertaken. We can go back to the overthrow of the popular democratic government in British Guyana in 1953. We can come through to the brutal intervention in Libya in 2011, which turned that country into a haven for terrorism, you know, which wasn't about protecting human rights. It was about oil interests, and it was about exerting imperial power. We can talk about the 2003 invasion of Iraq. We can talk about, you know, there's literally dozens of interventions and coups that we could talk about, and the themes are are always the same. It's about the imposition of imperial power and to hell with the local populations.
And I mean, one region particularly which has just been tortured effectively by the Brits and Americans for the last 75 years is the Middle East. You mentioned Libya and Iraq, but then you've got Afghanistan, you've got Palestine, which was given away to the Zionist movement by the British. Just every country in that region has had a history which has been written in part by the British and Americans. Can you talk a little bit about why the British and Americans have intervened so heavily in that region? And then obviously as well, there's the 6 Gulf dictatorships which go back centuries, and these are medieval regimes which behead people that oppose the mafia families which run them. Why is there been such intervention in the Middle East, and what's been the result for the people of the Middle East?
I mean, traditionally, the overwhelming reason why the British and the Americans have wanted to control the Middle East is because of oil interests. I mean, that has been the major, undoubted reason. And, you know, the Saudis sitting on top of some of the world's largest oil deposits, and then some of the small Gulf protectorates that Britain installed 200 years ago, and which they've been propping up ever since. You know, these have been key to controlling the global economy. You know, whoever controls those states, whoever backs up those repressive regimes, plays a key role in determining a lot of international economic policies. And that certainly motivated the British and the Americans to conduct a lot of interventions in the Middle East. It hasn't always been about that. If you look at the range of interventions in Syria and Iraq and Jordan, and you say Palestine as well over the decades, it has been about ensuring that the correct economic and political models are in place, ones that promote the economic interests of Western corporations and the international economy. When alternative movements come along that challenge that power and that interest, they will be overthrown. Classic example, Gamal Abdel Nasser comes to power in Egypt in 1952 in a coup, overthrows the British-backed king, who'd been in power for a long time, propped up by the British. Nasser comes in with a pretty popular agenda, land reform, to benefit the rural poor of Egypt, expropriating some of the Western companies operating in Egypt in order to tax those companies more to benefit the local population. So what do the British do? Well, they immediately start trying to assassinate him. And, you know, we now know, because information has come out over the years, we now know bits and pieces about some of those assassination plans, still not very much actually, but bits and pieces have come out. Britain collaborating with the Muslim Brotherhood to try and overthrow Nasser. And then it culminated in the military intervention in 1956 in Suez to try and overthrow Nasser, which failed. Nasser stayed in power until 1970. And that was seen as a kind of seminal event in British foreign policy, that the period of British intervention and imperial interest in the Middle East was over. Of course, that was false, because the following year, Britain intervened in a very similar situation in some ways, Oman, a very little known intervention. Britain intervened in Oman to prop up probably the most dictatorial, most repressive regime in world history in the last 150, 200 years. Sultan Timur, who banned the wearing of glasses, speaking to people for more than 15 minutes in public, I'm not joking, Britain intervened to prop up this straight dictator who was fighting off an independence movement, a popular uprising, to actually try and bring about some notion of economic development in the country. Britain intervened to prop him up, sent the military to stop that rebellion, that military uprising, and kept our man in power. And in fact, the descendants of that guy are still in power. The current Sultan was also installed with British help a few years ago. Before that, there was a Sultan of Oman who'd been in power for 50 years, repressive, propped up with British arms, economic support, constant diplomatic apologias. This is British foreign policy for you. You know, these are our allies. Our allies are the repressive regimes. They're not the popular independence movements that are wanting to promote the interests of their populations.
And how robust do you think the Anglo-American Empire is now? Because I agree with everything you're saying about this empire being the main reactionary force in the world in terms of putting down popular rebellions and getting rid of governments which are working in the interests of their people. But you have seen over the last 25 years quite a lot of governments, democratic governments, come to power, particularly in Latin America, which are working against the interests of foreign corporations, or at least getting the percentage for their own people. Do you think that the Anglo-American Empire is at the weakest it's ever been since 1945 now? And do you think that is a hope for humanity?
Yeah, I do actually. I think you're right on both counts. I think it is weaker than at any point, and that does give hope. I think it is harder to get away with the kinds of interventions and coups that have taken place in the earlier part of the post-war period. Partly because there is independent media around that can expose these things much more quickly than could ever have happened in the past. But also, yes, because the ability to unilaterally operate in this world is much more difficult now than it probably ever has been in the past. China, for all its ills, and I'm not a fan of China, and it's an authoritarian regime that I don't think that progressive people should really be supporting. But China will increasingly, over the decades, act as a deterrent to US global power, rather like the Soviet Union did in the post-war period. Again, Soviet Union, not a benign power, a malign power, but it did protect the world from some of the excesses that the US could have engaged in if they'd have wanted to. I think the rise of China and the rise of, yes, other countries around the world, in Latin America, even to a certain extent in Africa, certainly in Asia, has made it more difficult for the Western powers to control what's going on in those countries. You know, there has been a bit of a democratization of economic policy making around the world, I think, in countries. I think populations are on alert for intervention in their country, interference in their countries. And so it's more difficult. It's more difficult for the Western powers to call the shots. I think that's why they're particularly concerned about Ukraine. They've wanted to demonstrate that Western power is still alive and well. They have to stop Russia and Ukraine, otherwise it would show weakness. And I think that if they lost out to Russia and Ukraine, it would have knock-on effects elsewhere around the world. You know, they've already had disastrous interventions in Afghanistan, complete failure. Pretty disastrous in Iraq, pretty much a failure as well. Libya, pretty much a failure. Syria, total failure, government still in power. So Anglo-American power has not achieved many of its objectives in the last few decades. So they are under pressure. And I do think it is a hope for humanity, but the key thing is for that hope for humanity to be democratic governments, you know, not authoritarian regimes, but proper democratic governments, the sorts of ones which too often have been undermined in the past.
And what do you think the significance of what we're seeing in Gaza will be for the future? Because for me, I think it's not an exaggeration to say it's a turning point in world history, because all the myths which you've been exploding for decades have never been this exposed. Because you're watching, or people are watching daily, the mass murder of children, the use of prohibited weapons, ethnic cleansing, genocide, all backed to the hilt by the US, the UK, Germany, other European countries, all the countries which have told us for centuries that they're doing wonderful things for the world and they believe in these values. No one can believe that now, anyone who's watching what's happening. So firstly, what do you think the significance will be of what we're seeing in Gaza? And secondly, why do the US and UK give such slavish support to a country which I believe it's not in their interest now to support, because it's having so much blowback in terms of global public opinion and other things as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think for many people, the penny has dropped over Gaza. As you say, they're seeing this total support for a genocide on the part of their governments. Britain, the US, Germany in particular, many other European countries. And many people are shocked. I think many people are genuinely surprised, actually, at the extent to which their governments have been supporting Israel, no matter what Israel has done, no matter what level of atrocity. And I think that that is a once-in-a-generation politicization of large numbers of people in the country in a way that we haven't seen since, well, Iraq in 2003, and maybe before that, Suez in 1956. You know, these are sort of seminal periods when people suddenly realize how their system works. So I do think it will have knock-on effects. But of course, we are dealing here with huge ideological power. You and I might think that large numbers of people have changed their minds about this, but there's still vast numbers of people who are still watching the news, still reading the media, and they're not being told the things that we are seeing, the things that we know about, the complicity about, you know, the extent of the complicity that we see, that we're documenting. They don't even know about that because they're not being told about it. They're not reading about it every day. So it may not be so widespread, this change in attitude as we would like to think. It's a portion of the public who are seeing things for how they actually are. But it might not be the whole population of the country, which is kind of what, you know, we need more people to understand that this should be a real turning point in how we see our government's role in the world. With the question about why are we supporting Israel, I mean, I think for the UK, there are two particular reasons for the extent of that British support. One is that British elites have to demonstrate to the US that they are supporting them, that it would be very difficult for Whitehall to go against American policy towards Israel. You know, there is this special relationship. That's the key thing that British officials want to promote. If British officials go up against this major feature of US foreign policy, total support for Israel, that would be very hard to justify to the Americans. You know, that'd be hard to explain away. And if you go back to the declassified files, there's a document from 1970, for example, written by the policy planning staff in Britain, saying that we have to associate ourselves with the US on Middle Eastern affairs, otherwise they'll put pressure on us to change policy, and it will undermine the special relationship if we go up against the Americans. The other reason why Britain is so supportive of Israel is something that you and I have done a lot of work on, which is the extent of the Israel lobby in the UK, you know, where large numbers of Conservative MPs, Labour MPs have been paid by Israel to go to visit Israel, to have briefing sessions with Israeli officials, Labour Friends of Israel, Conservative Friends of Israel. They play a very influential role in British politics. And there's no doubt that Israel exercises an influence over British foreign policy making, sort of way beyond probably any other state, with the possible exception of the US. The only other foreign state apart from the US might be the Saudis. I mean, the Saudis are clearly very embedded in Whitehall as well, but certainly the Saudis and Israel wield very disproportionate influence over British foreign policy making in a very undemocratic way as well.
And I wanted to ask actually about something you mentioned, which was US control of British politics, because this is something I've done a lot of work on and has actually surprised me. Can you talk about the extent to which the British polity is dominated by America and how they do it? And then obviously there's also the fact that we are militarily occupied by the country as well. Can you just go through some of the ways that our whole politics is governed by the US?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does make sense to talk about an American military occupation of Britain, actually. One of the first books I ever remember reading was a brilliant book by Duncan Campbell, the investigative journalist, who wrote this book called The Unsinkable Aircraft Carrier. And he documented the extent of British military, of US military and intelligence facilities in Britain. It's still a really good book to read 40 years on, because there are these 11 US bases around the country that you've documented, that we've both worked on. They're called RAF bases, but they're US Air Force bases. They're US intelligence bases in a lot of cases. It's hard to find out what's going on there. There's blanket refusal in Parliament on the part of ministers to tell the public what happens behind the doors of those US Air Force bases. I mean, the Ministry of Defense can't even admit they're US Air Force bases. So they're shrouded in secrecy. We know that there's at least 1,000 US officers at RAF Crawton, one of the key bases. Menwith Hill in Yorkshire plays a key role in the US intelligence network globally. And that's a big GCHQ, National Security Agency joint base, plays a role in drone operations that the US conducts around the world, all done with the specific help of the UK. Shrouded in secrecy. Very little is known about, what goes on there. And I think that that is sort of symptomatic of the infiltration of our polity and our politics by this superpower. I mean, if you mention US foreign policy, you can't talk about the US being a rogue state. You can't oppose NATO without being called a traitor. You'll never see in the mainstream media stories that say that the US plays a pernicious role in world affairs even. You will have isolated stories about odd criticisms of the US, but never an accurate discussion about the negative impact that country plays in world affairs. It's protected. It's protected from serious scrutiny. And it's protected by The Guardian as much as it is by the right-wing media. So the US is seen as a benign power. Hardly any politicians will challenge it in public. When Jeremy Corbyn did try and do that, to an extent, when he went up against the traditional view, the establishment view, that we shouldn't be such a slavish supporter of US foreign policy, he was slammed, he was constantly criticized, and in the end removed by a load of propaganda being targeted at him through the media, through the political system, in order to protect that, the US interest. And there's all sorts of organizations in the UK that act to solidify the UK establishment's links to the US establishment. The British-American project that you've done work on, the British-American project, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, all these operations, Le Cercle is another one. These are all fora in which British elites and American elites work together and solidify that intelligence relationship, the military relationship, and the diplomatic relationship. And breaking that down is very difficult.
And the CIA, one of their major bases in the world is at Croughton, right, RAF Croughton, and then you've got the NSA at GCHQ Bude in Cornwall. So it's very, very hard to view Britain as a sovereign country when you understand all this information you've been given. It's interesting talking to you and hearing this avalanche of facts about how the world really works, but it's also amazing that you cannot hear these truths in the mainstream. How do you think that the situation now is different from when you started out? Because obviously we started Declassified UK 5 years ago, and Declassified couldn't have existed 20 years ago, because it was pre the internet we have now, which allows people like us to get the word out and get our stories out in a way that wasn't previously available. You always had to go through the mainstream media. So obviously there is a way of getting around the state narrative now, which worries the powers that be. How much should they be worried, or are they going to clamp down on that again?
Yeah, I mean, I think the opportunities are much greater now, like you said, than they were 20 years ago because of social media and independent media. But the mainstream media is even more closed and even more disciplined than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. I mean, there were many more dissident voices across the mainstream 30, 40 years ago. I mean, you and I spoke to John Pilger about this before he died. And he said that he's never known a time in that it's been more difficult for dissenting critical voices to get published in the mainstream. And this is at a time when the media is meant to have opened up, when you can get anything published anywhere. So there's no formal coercion that's telling mainstream media editors not to publish certain things. The system has just become even more disciplined. But of course, it's become much more divided because you've now got the mainstream world of the press and broadcast, who are very much part of the establishment. And then you've got the alternative world of independent media and social media. That's where we at Declassified are obviously located. The mainstream media don't want to hear about any of our investigations. They're not interested in covering what we're covering. But it does give us the opportunity to reach far more people than we've ever been able to do before. We don't have to go through the gatekeepers. I mean, you know, when I started writing, I remember trying to get a few articles in The Guardian back in like the late 1980s, early 1990s. There was always a gatekeeper. There was always an editor that would say, oh, well, you can't say that. That's a little bit controversial, isn't it? I don't think we can get away with it. Cut out the paragraph, cut out the article sometimes. Say, no, we can't run it. Well, now we can publish. You know, we can publish stuff now off our own backs. That's important. That means that there is less censorship in the whole system. But the key message for me is that there's never been a time when we need to change that mainstream media more than we do now. My own personal view is that this is probably the single biggest problem we face. The way in which the mainstream media still determine public attitudes towards many things, still help shape policies that aren't in the public interest, because millions of people are still reading the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, and not only the right wing, but the Guardian and the New Statesman as well. They're still watching the BBC, they're still watching Channel 4, and they're thinking that they're being told the truth about what Britain's role in the world is. Millions of people every day think they are being told the truth, and they're not. They're absolutely not being told the truth. I would like there to be a much bigger, more wide-ranging campaign in the UK to encourage people to move away from relying on the mainstream media and move them towards independent media like us and others. We're not the only ones who are trying to do a decent job of public service journalism. I think that's a major task that we face, and I don't think that anything will seriously change in the UK actually in terms of better policies coming from the government until large numbers of the public stop being brainwashed by the mainstream media.